So my name is Meredith Bayne. I'm here from Portland, Oregon, and the topic that I'm going to cover in my talk is in the test engineer role, how cross-functionality leads to a better engineering process. So I thought of this topic because the very first time I ever looked at Angular code was when I was on this team. It was a very small team at a super large company. We worked on a massive application that supported like all kinds of countries and got a lot of hits all the time. And one time we were in a planning meeting, I think it was like a backlog grooming or something like that, sprint planning, and management was like, we are no longer going to have quality engineers and developers. You're all software engineers now, so you're going to have to learn each other's roles. And part of our application was an Angular 1X application, so my partner showed me the code, and it really, really scared me when I saw those ng-ifs and stuff. And I was like, these people are crazy if they think I'm going to learn this. But early on, when I was learning how to code, my mentor said that I just need to accept that I'm not going to know stuff, and I'm never going to know everything. So I kept that in mind and remained uncomfortable. And eventually, my team became more cross-functional. So the developers were able to write test code, and I was able to write development code. And I learned a lot and grew. And we became a very close-knit, efficient team, one of the most efficient teams that I've worked for. And what I mean by cross-functionality is just having a really broad set of skills so that you can fill the shoes of anyone on your team, whether it's like a developer or a product person or a test automation specialist. And then the engineering process I'm talking about is just when a feature is developed to when it's released. So that might be your Agile process or Scrum, your 2-week process, something like that. So just a little bit about me. Here's my Twitter handle. I'm also on Instagram quite a lot. And then the bottom is my GitHub. I'm originally from rural New Mexico, a teeny tiny town with like 5,000 people on the edge of the Navajo reservation. After I lived there, I moved to California and went to school at Berkeley. My degree's in earth science. I don't know, kind of random. And since then, I've worked in the Bay Area in tech. I've also worked in Denver, Colorado for a very small startup. I worked in Austin, Texas for a startup and then a mid-sized company. And now I've worked in Portland for 2 of the largest companies in the world. So I have a lot of experience working on different teams. The majority of my professional experience is in this test engineer role. Right now I am an Android developer, but I have years and years of experience working as QA engineer, quality engineer, whatever you want to call it. So I found in my professional life that there were a few negative aspects of being a test engineer. I did really love it because it allowed me to wear a lot of different hats. So I could work on DevOps stuff, write code, and work with product owners. But then the way I interacted with people on my team could sometimes be a little bit muddled and confusing. Like recruiters would ask me if I knew how to code on the phone during phone screenings. And I would think, okay, that's weird because I've written these huge test automation frameworks. Why are you asking me that? I just felt like it was a little bit of an exclusive community. And I didn't feel like included or like my opinions and talents were of value. I'm definitely no stranger to feeling excluded in my personal life. I was born with a hearing impairment. I also have an invisible disability that requires accommodations sometimes. So I've always kind of felt like I didn't quite fit in. And then those experiences ended up transferring into my professional life until I was on this team that really promoted cross-functionality. So some of the points I really want to emphasize is there's a really big problem when we're relying on a single role to test an app. And this slows our process. There's always a bottleneck when we reach the testing phase of the software development lifecycle if we say testing must be done only at this phase and only by people who have this role. If we test throughout the process, we can avoid that bottleneck a little bit and cut down regression testing periods. I mean, I've worked at places where regression testing was more than a week long. And Angular makes this really easy. Testing is very accessible. There's tools like Protractor, which is great. It can be written in TypeScript. You can use Jasmine Karma, syntax, or whatever your team feels most comfortable with. And using those techniques, transitioning from development to testing phase can be seamless. So you hand something over to the person who needs to test. They already have the tools they need to get going. There's no bottleneck. It's very fast moving. And also, I want to emphasize that the entire team owns testing. So when we release a feature, if it's got critical bugs, or the application crashes, or the users hate it and they're calling customer support, or it's losing money, the whole team is responsible for that. So we should really care about testing our product. And I think sometimes even as a developer, I forget a little bit, like I want to rush and get my code up to PR really, really fast so that I can get brownie points or something like that. But it is pretty important for me to test my code before I get it up there so that I don't hand it over at the very last minute with a ton of bugs. Okay, so I keep saying test engineer, which is not really an industry standard term. So what do I mean by this? If you do a job search for something like test automation or protractor, a lot of different role titles will come up. Some of them are like QA engineer, quality engineer, SDET, SET. So just in general, I'm saying test engineer to kind of incorporate all of that. So what are some of the skills that a test engineer will have? Also, if you look at job descriptions, they can vary really widely. In fact, I've seen some that kind of have almost unreasonable requirements, like more than 8 years of Java experience, and you must know all AWS tools and stuff like that. That's not really what I've seen successful test engineers doing in the real world. Here's just what I've witnessed from my experience. So test engineers will perform manual testing and write automated tests, functional tests, or end-to-end tests, depending on your team and how you define that in some cases. Test engineers are expected to have strong technical skills, know the product with extreme detail, communicate well with developers, and set up CI builds, etc. So that does involve some pretty complex DevOps skills. Sometimes I think that those requirements can go a little bit underappreciated. So there is kind of a big problem with being a test engineer and how we relate to the other members of our team. Test engineers can struggle a little bit. As the product grows, long regression cycles leave less time to develop tools. So I've definitely worked places where we had those long manual testing cycles, and I've gotten very bored and gotten a lot of pressure, like, why don't we have more automation? Why don't we have a device farm set up? It's just like, I just don't have time. So that can be a really big struggle. And bugs are found much later in the process and can be harder to fix. So the reason that they're harder to fix sometimes, especially working at a really large company, is when the QA engineer or quality engineer sends the bug back, I might have totally forgotten about the feature and everything it was supposed to do. So sometimes I'll find myself digging through Jira trying to find the old requirements. And if you're like me and you work at a really large company where a ton of people are contributing to the same code base, the code may have changed quite a lot, so it can be really hard to track down. So it's super important to find bugs earlier on. That's why working together cohesively to set up the test cases as a team and to design the code and algorithms together can help prevent that. And then also a lot of quality engineers, test engineers really want to be product experts, and we don't have time to do that if we're bogged down with a huge regression cycle. There may be features introduced by other teams that affect what I'm working on, but then I have no idea what those are because I've been so busy. And when they come up and they start affecting my own work, that can be a big problem. So how can we change this? Change comes with being a little bit uncomfortable. So I was talking about the first time I looked at Angular code and how it really frightened me and how I just really didn't want to do it, but I stuck with it. That's kind of how growth has happened in all areas of my life. I've never been able to grow without being super uncomfortable and facing the unknown. So in the beginning, it's definitely going to be hard to try to pick up those other skill sets, or at least have an understanding of them, what goes into them, so that you can support your teammates. But I encourage people to stick with it. So one way we can support each other is to encourage growth. So some people who work as test engineers are more into manual testing, which is great. And I've noticed that those kinds of people really like to know the product and become product experts. So I would encourage those people to pursue that, to pursue their passions and their skills. So these kinds of people could potentially, in a planning session when we bring up a new feature that we're going to develop, they know the test cases right away, right before we even get coding, and can call out all the risky areas. Like, here's where bugs tend to happen, or I saw this last time, so we should really watch out for that. And that way I can design my code with that in mind. Also, they have an excellent relationship with the product team and can answer questions. So for me, sometimes when I read acceptance criteria, I'm like, I'm not sure what this means, or what happens if this is there. I can go to these people, and they know exactly how the product works. Also, if I get a bug, sometimes I'm like, well, has this been like this, or is this a new bug? I don't know. And then I can go ask these people. And I think that gives a lot of people a sense of value, right? Like, they can use their skills and their passions to contribute to the team. So another thing is to allow people to shine. So engineers who possess strong development, testing, and DevOps skills, instead of just being bogged down with testing or trying to crank out a bunch of automated test cases at the very last minute before the release, or writing really complex and confusing bug reports, they can refine tools for test automation, which the Angular team has really made a lot easier, and measure development productivity and look for places to improve. So if we move toward cross-functionality, we're not solving all of the problems with the development lifecycle. We're just focusing on better problems. So as developers, we're also responsible. So it's good for me to know the test cases before starting on the feature, otherwise I have no idea where I'm going. I'm not necessarily talking about doing very strict test-driven development. If you're good at that, that's really awesome. I find it very challenging. What I do is I just put a couple of notes in the ticket I've been assigned, like bullet points, with the test cases that I think are important, run them by the product owner, and run them by the test engineer, and make sure we're on the same page. Then after I'm done developing, I can scaffold, if not actually write, the happy path test, automated end-to-end tests for the feature. So the happy path is just the ideal user flow, so it's pretty easy. Also, I can ask questions and trust the expertise of others. Sometimes I have a tendency as a developer to just kind of close my office door and get really angry because I can't figure something out. But somebody once told me that whenever you feel angry and stuck, it's good to ask someone else how you can be helpful to them. So I'll get up and walk to somebody else's desk, ask what they're working on, and then see if they can help me out. Okay, so now we're all cross-functional. We're just software engineers, like they said in that meeting. We're all software engineers who happen to specialize in the things that we're passionate about, where our skills really shine. So what can we work on? Improving test automation frameworks, so not just cranking out tests, but really improving it. Monitoring production for any issues, measuring development productivity, automating build processes for releases, including all verifications needed. So these are all tasks that I think, they're just some of the tasks that I think are pretty important that sometimes I haven't had time for, just because of the bottleneck of testing. So this is the Diversity and Inclusion Conference. So I just wanted to touch on how this relates to D&I, or diversity and inclusion. Exclusivity hurts. So as a test engineer, I would often feel a little bit excluded. I wouldn't get invited to some meetings because they were technical meetings, even though I felt like I was a technical person. Getting asked if I knew how to code by colleagues, recruiters, et cetera. So using this approach will improve communication between team members and increase a sense of value. And it's really important for me personally to feel valued, and I'm sure for other people. Like, I'll even ask the product owner, like, how is this making us money? Or why is this feature important? Why would our users want this? If I know the feature that I'm working on is important, then I feel like I'm valued. Also, I've read a few articles and seen a few studies that show underrepresented groups, and I'll just talk about women because that's what I have experience with, leave tech when their role is not fulfilling. So I've definitely had moments where I was in a job doing something that I thought was boring and wasn't utilizing my skill set, and I wasn't following my passion, and I was like, why am I even in tech? Like, forget it. Like, I don't belong here. I'm just going to go. And I think back to that team where my partner was teaching me Angular, and how kind he was and how helpful he was. And I just think that's really cool. I'm asked a lot by my managers and friends and other people, like, how can we get more women on the team? How can we bring more women into tech? But I think it's really important to remember that a lot of women leave tech. So it's like, how can we create an environment where everyone feels included, no matter what their role is? And also, when we value each other, we demonstrate that we value ourselves as well. And that's it.